Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kerry Grady Vincent, and I am the Senior Manager of Scientific and Clinical Programs at Osteoporosis Canada. I will be your moderator for today's webinar, Biologics and Biosimilars, an overview for healthcare providers. Before we begin, Osteoporosis Canada acknowledges the land that our offices, located in Toronto, are on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. At Osteoporosis Canada, we educate Canadians about bone health, including healthcare professionals and their clients. We are the only national organization serving people who have or are at risk for osteoporosis. Our Scientific Advisory Council is made up of experts in osteoporosis and bone metabolism and is a volunteer membership. Comprised of clinicians, researchers, and educators, the SAC advises Osteoporosis Canada's board and staff on scientific and medical issues. OC provides medically accurate information to patients, healthcare providers, and the public. Services include programs and support groups, educational webinars, podcasts, digital tools, and resources available at Osteoporosis and community resources. We are excited about today's presentation, which will provide information about biologics and biosimilar medications used in the treatment of osteoporosis, their benefits, and how to speak to patients about these new treatment options. If you do have questions during the webinar, remember to click the question and answer button on your screen to submit your questions, and we will try to get to as many as we can in the time permitting. Before we begin, make sure you have your speakers turned up fully so that you can hear the presentation clearly. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Alan Lowe. Dr. Lowe is a clinical professor in the Faculty of Pharmaceutical Sciences at the University of British Columbia, care director at MedInfuse Health, and primary care pharmacist, pharmacy lead at BioPro Biologics Pharmacy. He is a member of our Scientific Advisory Council. He is a board advisor with the GI Society and a member of the medical board of healthchoicesfirst.com, a patient video education resource. Dr. Lowe has experience in a wide variety of health and administrative settings, including direct patient care in the hospital and clinics, clinical and practice-based research, a consultant in healthcare and clinical projects, as well as health advocacy. Without any further ado, please join me in welcoming Alan.
Thank you very much, Kerry. Thanks for the introduction. And I'll just bring up my slides if we can have that popped up. That's great. Looks like they're up. And welcome, everyone, and welcome to the session on biologics and biosimilars. Thank you, Kerry and Osteoporosis Canada, for the invitation to come speak with the group, hoping to provide you an overview of biologics and biosimilars. And I know that we've got a variety of folks on, so I may be covering some things that you know already, so some patience on that. And hopefully you will get and walk away with some additional information that is new to you that you can incorporate into your practice. I have these disclosures with respect to speaking on our area that are listed there. And also with this webinar, I hope that by the end of this, you'll be able to define biologics and biosimilars, describe the approval process and the characteristics of biosimilars, be able to explain the benefits of biosimilars and their place in therapy, as well as how to best incorporate biosimilar options in your practice and how you manage and help care for patients. So just to begin, starting off with the basics, what is a biologic medicine? Well, biologics are large, complex drug molecules, so they are a drug. They're used in treatment of many different conditions, and more are being added as new biologics come out. But just to name a few, osteoporosis has biologics in the armamentarium. Same with treating diabetes, inflammatory bowel disease, multiple sclerosis, cancers, psoriasis, rheumatoid arthritis, and many other conditions that are just too many to list here. So the big difference with respect to biologics is they're not chemically made, but they're actually derived from living organisms. So essentially, they're coming from plants, microorganisms, animals, and humans. So essentially, in short, we can talk about them as drugs that are grown versus synthetically made, and that's what makes them very complex. So these biologics made from living organisms go through a process that's similar to this. So as you can see, it does have many steps and quite complicated, but it begins with modifying host cells that actually will reproduce and make the biologic or make the drug. This could be bacteria, it could be yeast, it could be mammalian cells, and it's usually incorporating recombinant DNA technology, as there's ways now, of course, to program host cells to create a specific cell or molecule. These cells are then grown, and under specific conditions, there's fermentation and other upstream processes, but they then generate a drug that is extracted, folded, purified, so that we get a drug that can actually be used in humans, of course, moving through clinical trials and that kind of thing. Most of these, of course, are going to be injectables or administered parenterally. And this is because the stability of a complex product like this, which oftentimes is a protein, won't really be stable on a shelf at room temperature or sitting in a dry environment. So oftentimes they are formulated in a vial and require to be stored in the refrigerator and follow cold chain processes. So biologics are more complex than small molecules, and I just want to give you a little bit of a visual as we look at the differences and the complexity between them. So if we begin with the synthetic molecule, so let's just use ASA. So this is plain old aspirin. If we call that 1 times, or that's the reference, we then go to some drugs that are produced in bacteria and yeast. So let's say this is insulin. So it's about 32 times as big based on weight. So it's 5.8 kilodaltons versus ASA, which is about 180 daltons. So you can already see that it's 32 times bigger. But when we start talking about a biologic, we're talking about something that is 833 times bigger and 150 kilodaltons. And these are the monoclonal antibodies. They've got glycoproteins attached to them as well. And another way to look at it, let's turn it into a comparison of complexity. It's like comparing where ASA is a bicycle moving on to an automobile. But when we start talking about biologics, it has the sophistication of a jet airliner. So we're talking about a very complex molecule. And here's some of the differences in kind of a summary. As we talked about, the size is a big difference. The structure, there's the primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary structures. So there's a lot of side chains and a lot of connections to these molecular structures. The synthetically created drugs are oftentimes very homogeneous. That is, there's one form, and each pill to pill, batch to batch, they're going to be exactly the same. So they are chemical. How salt is salt from one batch to the other, it's still salt, exactly the same molecule. However, when you look at a biologic, it is actually heterogeneous and is not 100% identical, even from batch to batch, as they make the second run of creating that molecule. So generally, immunogenicity is inert with regards to small molecules. They don't react with the body's immune system as frequently or as significantly, whereas biologics, there is that potential to induce an antibody response so that the immune system is recognizing it because it's big, it's a protein, and it might produce antibodies against it. One is a chemical synthesis with a small molecule, and the other is a living system, which is required to produce it. Stability, like I had mentioned, room temperature is quite easy with small molecules, but oftentimes we're looking at temperature control, also even agitation. You'll see that those are working with vaccines, which is also a biologic. Oftentimes they do not shake vigorously. And that's because if you do agitate it too much, it can also destroy and break apart these very large molecules. So much more control is needed with these biologics. So as I mentioned with the biologic variation, they do have inherent variability. And, another analogy that I can use is that we are talking about things that are living organisms. So just think about an apple tree and thinking about 2 apple trees beside each other of the same variety. They actually may not have identically tasting or identically looking fruit, even though that they are grown in the same environment and the same year. And even one fruit beside each other, one might be bigger, one might be smaller, even though it's growing on the same tree. And so we can think about biologic variation in a similar way. And that is, they do vary over the manufacturing lifetime. So if it was an apple tree, as it got older, it's going to be a little bit different. And same with batches of products. And this could be just environmental changes. So even the temperature of the environment that this is being manufactured, if that varies slightly, there will be slight variations in this biologic as well. There's also manufacturing changes that can occur. Now, most of the changes, if they are big, need to be reported to Health Canada. And Health Canada needs to make that decision on the approval, whether that is acceptable and whether new clinical trials need to be done to ensure that it's the same as the effects of the initial product when it was first approved. So the manufacturing process may change because of the difference in suppliers. So if it's grown in cell culture media from one supplier to the other, that cell culture media is going to change a little bit. That's like changing soil for a tree. So even though you try to get the same soil, it probably isn't 100% identical. New purification methods might be introduced as efficiency comes in, or batches are bigger. As you do purification, making 1,000 units compared to 1,000,000 units is going to change some of these manufacturing sites, purification methods, etc. So just graphically speaking, you can see from batch 1 to 2 to 3, they do have the same basic overall primary structure, but little differences here and there. They're not expected to have clinical impact, but it's just recognized that there are these minor variations that can occur. This kind of explains why these biologics are so costly. They are very targeted therapies, so they're very specific. They have a more potent effect. And, oftentimes with biologics, they are administered less frequently than they might be with, let's say, an oral small molecule treatment. So we might be talking daily treatments compared to a biologic that could be once a month, once every 3 months, or once every 6 months, as we're going to talk about with denosumab. So it's normally a once every 6-month targeted treatment. It targets the rank ligand and inhibits it so that it prevents the formation of osteoclasts. So this improves bone density and reduces fractures. And with its every 6-month dosing, for a lot of people, it is much more convenient to treat osteoporosis that way. These biologics, of course, are difficult and time-intensive to manufacture, as you might pick up as I went over some of the processes. These biologics also require higher levels of testing. And of course, the clinical trial costs are also higher. Patient support programs are very common with respect to biologics. This might help to cover the infusion fee. It also provides some support for practitioners who need to complete paperwork in order to get coverage. Again, because these medications are expensive, coverage is particularly important, whether it be from the public plan, the private plan, or even in some cases, the patient support program may provide financial assistance to those with low income or limited or fixed income. Biologics oftentimes are administered, if not by IV, through different kinds of injection devices. They may be auto-injectors, and that's going to add to the cost. So as another example is we're all quite familiar with the EpiPen, and it's actually quite expensive. In fact, over $100 for that pen, whereas the epinephrine itself is not very costly. And so having these auto-injectors or these injection devices also adds to the cost. You can imagine maintaining cold chain, particularly nowadays when shipping and delivery is very, I guess, unpredictable sometimes, as we've heard with some of the things happening with the railway. That coupled with short expiry and limited shelf life, particularly if it comes to room temperature, all add to this potential increase or high cost of biologics. But of course, they're very powerful drugs. And we can see this comparison here. So just looking at some of the treatments in osteoporosis, you can see from a measurement of change in total hip bone mineral density, and these are separate trials. So these aren't comparative head-to-head trials, but this is sufficient to give us a reasonable comparison. And with the size of these changes, it's quite reasonable to conclude that there are these differences. And as we can see, alendronate's increase in bone mineral density is lower than zoledronic acid, which is a parenteral therapy, still a bisphosphonate and a small molecule. But as we get to denosumab, we see almost a doubling of the bone mineral density built. So we can see that these targeted therapies can have more profound effects. Subsequent entry biologics, so these are the biologics that come into play when the brand name or the reference biologic loses its patent. So that time period can vary. The overall patent time in Canada is 25-year patent. And also when drugs get approved, there are some stipulations to have a minimum of an 8-year patent that the innovative manufacturer can recoup essentially their investment. But once the patents are over, that's when biosimilars come in. Now, although they're allowed to enter the market, that originator or reference biologic company does not have to share the recipe with the biosimilar maker. And this is why we might get slight variations, but they are biosimilars, and Health Canada ensures that the important parts of it are demonstrated to be highly similar. And the similarity is sufficient that there is the same clinical effect and safety when it's compared in clinical trials. So just to introduce and make something very clear, because this gets confused by many patients, is that biosimilars are not a generic drug. So generic drugs are 100% identical. They are chemicals, they can be reproduced, and they're the same molecule. Whereas biosimilars are not an identical copy. They're highly similar, they're very close to the reference, and they have the same clinical effect as measured in clinical trials, the same clinical safety, but it is not going to be an identical copy when we talk about the molecule. And of course, all biosimilars, and we say they're not a generic drug, it's because they're also all brand name drugs. Every one of them will have their own brand name and specifically refers to that particular one. This is some quotes and some information coming from Health Canada. So directly, this is what they state. And that is a biosimilar is a biologic drug that is highly similar to a biologic drug that was already authorized for sale. So that means it's patterned and essentially referenced to an originator biologic. That's the one that came before it. Health Canada authorizes biosimilars for sale using the same rigorous regulatory standards for quality, efficacy, and safety as they do for all other biologic drugs as well. So it's not that there's any lower standard. It's going to be the same standards and thresholds, and it's still looking at the quality, efficacy, and safety. And in Canada, the term interchangeability often refers to the ability for a patient to be changed from one drug to another equivalent drug by a pharmacist without the intervention of a prescriber who wrote the prescription. So again, to separate it from a generic, when a drug is written, if there's a generic version available, the pharmacist can't interchange it to one of the many generics that are often out there as options. Whereas with respect to a biologic drug, what is prescribed, so the brand name that's written on the prescription must be adhered to, and the pharmacist would have to check with the prescriber before switching to another brand or to a biosimilar. There are some provinces where pharmacists have the ability and are authorized to do something called adaptations, and that is to switch that medication being the same molecule. And biosimilars and biologics, the reference biologic, have the same molecule name, but we know that they're not interchangeable from a Health Canada perspective. But a pharmacist could adapt for the purposes of patient care and in the interest of the patient. So it's not switching for the pharmacy's financial purposes. It's not switching for convenience of the pharmacy, but it's switching because of a patient need. And this would be an adaptation that has to be documented and is also required to inform the prescriber so they're aware of as well. Health Canada's authorization of biosimilars is not a declaration of equivalence to the reference biologic drug. And Health Canada is not the controller of interchangeability, although they can state that it's interchangeable. And then, of course, it would be for the country. But when it says that it's not, it's actually up to the province to set its own regulatory and declaration of interchangeability. So talking about biosimilars, they must provide structural and functional studies, or the manufacturers need to provide those, as well as continuing clinical trials so that surveillance can be ongoing for biosimilar to be approved by Health Canada. They must demonstrate similarity of the biosimilar to the reference biologic, and also biosimilars are expected to be just as effective and as safe as the originator. What is different is that it's certainly at a lower cost than the originator or reference biologic. And this is going to lead to potential increase in access or use by patients. So they are still relatively higher cost than a small molecule because clinical trials are still required. When we talk about a generic medication, there's no requirement by Health Canada that a generic drug needs to be tested in clinical trials where patients with the condition are being treated. This is quite different with regards to a biosimilar. They do require clinical trials in humans with the condition that the reference drug was being treated in. Sometimes not all of the conditions, but certainly at least one. When we go into some more specifics about a biosimilar and its comparability to the reference product, we can see that it's highly similar with respect to these categories. The primary structure is going to be identical. So that's the part that makes it the molecule that it is. So denosumab is denosumab because of that primary structure. The list of amino acids that's there. But then there's this alpha helix, this secondary structure. Then we get into a tertiary structure. And then the quaternary structure is how these units are folded and assembled. But they are all still highly similar for affinity, if it's receptors, for its selectivity, for its pharmacokinetic profile, its functional activity, solubility, and comparable immunogenicity. Again, these are tested in clinical trials, as well as other chemical procedures and laboratory measurements. So anything that is determined and identified as clinically relevant when we're talking about biosimilars and biologics, they are being tested and reviewed by Health Canada with a relatively narrow variability range that's allowable. There's this concept of extrapolation when we're talking about biosimilars. That is, in order to keep this biosimilar at a lower cost when it comes out after a patent expires for a reference product, they do allow at Health Canada to extrapolate to another indication. And so you'll see that these highly similar from the reference to biosimilar are usually done using actual tests. So these are potentially clinical trials, these are laboratory tests and that kind of thing. And those still need to be required to be done, and in some ways are higher costs than the originator, who didn't have to do any of this comparison, but they did have to do the initial development to test this in different indications. So as a result, the originator may have many indications because they've done the clinical trials in order to help keep costs lower and as a reasonable scientific extrapolation. That is, if all of these things are the case that they're highly similar and it works in one indication, we can use scientific justification to extrapolate it to then Health Canada will approve on other uses and other indications. But there's still justification that has to be provided. It's not just an automatic. So a manufacturer would still have to apply to get other indications approved. This just gives you an example in adalimumab, which is originally the reference Humira. There are now 9 different versions. So it has kind of exploded. And so, you know, talking about and getting to understand and recognize these biologics and biosimilars is certainly becoming more and more important. And there's being used more and more in the community. So whether you're a community practitioner or a hospital practitioner, regardless of where you practice, you're going to be seeing these biologics for sure, and you probably have already, and they'll continue to expand. And it's just that it's relatively new in the osteoporosis field. This table just shows you some of the differences between them. Of course, because they are highly similar, many of the things are very similar. But as there are variations, and I'll just draw you to the attention of the storage time in days when it's kept at room temperature. So although for the long-term storage, it needs to be refrigerated, once it reaches room temperature, these storage expiry dates apply as long as it stays below 25 degrees. You cannot put it back into the refrigerator and get any extended time. This will be the time limits, but you can see they range from 14 days to 56 days and are different from the 14 days of the originator. So we are seeing some improvements in some ways because even though it is the biosimilar, there are ways to improve the stability and such that there is longer storage time, which could be a huge convenience for patients. But then there are also other changes that may not be as comfortable for one patient to another. That could be the injection device and that kind of thing. So biosimilars and osteoporosis treatment. Currently, one of the firsts where there was a biosimilar was teriparatide. This is Forteo, and this has come out a few years ago. And then recently with denosumab, where the originator is Prolia, it has now a biosimilar Jubbonti that's used in osteoporosis. And Xgeva, which is also denosumab used in some oncology indications, has a biosimilar called Wyost. And so that's also available. There's another biologic that's used in osteoporosis, that's romosozumab, and currently it's hasn't gotten a patent expiry, so therefore there is no biosimilar available in Canada, and likely one will be coming. There are some benefits with respect to having biosimilars available. They are lower cost. So from just the lower cost, it is going to help contribute to our healthcare system by being able to allocate dollars to other needs. And that may be improved access. So with the lower costing agents, sometimes the criteria for prior authorization are a little bit relaxed, or patients might even be able to afford the product because the cost is lower. And as you saw in the last slide, with 9 versions of adalimumab, that it's going to produce some market competition. And competition generally is good. So for practitioners and for patients, if all the different manufacturers are trying to do better than one another, the quality and the support and the access is just going to improve, I guess, for the end user. So market competition is generally thought of as a good thing, as long as nobody is cutting corners and doing anything less professionally than they should normally do. So I just wanted to bring up some biologic considerations as you think about these 2 different entities. So on average, biologics are more costly than small molecules, but they're also more targeted. So it's hard to say that they cost more. They might actually be more effective, and from a cost-effective approach, it might be superior to a small molecule that is, untargeted, goes systemically, and can affect side effects and affect the body in its entirety. Whereas with these biologics, it's much more targeted. Not that they're without side effects, but being more targeted tends to mean less side effects and a bigger efficacy. Public and private plans oftentimes will require approval. So they set criteria, and the patient has to meet these criteria before the coverage will kick in. And so sometimes, particularly if medications are used off-label, that is, hasn't been studied enough to be an approved indication, chances are a public or private plan won't cover the biologic, whereas they still would cover a small molecule that's low cost. But in cases like this, prior approval is needed. As I mentioned, most, if not all of them, need to be refrigerated, and cold chain cannot be broken, and it has limited stability at room temperature. And so during shipping, oftentimes there are these little temperature monitors that will track its entire transport process to see what the temperature has been from minute to minute. Almost all of these biologics are also administered parenterally. Since they are biologics, essentially proteins that can be broken down, they have to be administered directly into the bloodstream. So whether it's subcutaneous or intravenous, if it's to be administered orally, a lot of times the digestive system is going to break it down and render it useless. So that's something that has to be considered, because if it's intravenous, there are other expenses and inconveniences that come into play. And again, this is where the patient may have a say and have a preference. All of these biologics tend to have an effect on the immune system. That is, there is a slight increase in the risk of infections, some more than others, depending on the mechanism of the drug. So with the drugs that was mentioned for osteoporosis, with denosumab and romosozumab, the increase in infection rates are very slim or small compared to placebo. But still, it is recommended that all patients get the common vaccines before they start the drug, because after starting the drug, the blunting of that immune system, again, depends on the drug, some more than others, might actually reduce the vaccine response. So it's important, as much as possible, to get these vaccines in as soon as possible before starting the medication. And during that prior approval process is a good time to ensure that these vaccines have a chance to work, usually between kind of a 2 and 3 week window to have the vaccine take its full effect. When we start talking about the safety of biologics and biosimilars, the main adverse effects are injection site reactions that are going to be different from your small molecule, that don't have to be injected, of course. And this can give rise to infections on the skin. Because it does affect the immune system, fungal infections can also be possible, as well as other viral infections, such as respiratory ones. And for some stronger immunomodulating biologics, a TB skin test is often done. So it is a requirement for those biologics that are anti-B cell type drugs or anti-TNF drugs. And with denosumab, this is quite interesting and relatively recent data, but because they are so specific, they cause a profound effect, but they also cause the body to react and compensate in a different way, such that there is now reports that as soon as 7 months after stopping denosumab, when the next dose should be at month 6, loss of bone can actually be measured. And I'll have a bit of data to show you a little bit later on in this slide set. With respect to managing some of these things, providing injection training really goes a long way. Patients oftentimes do not inject properly themselves, or sometimes have difficulties if they've got arthritis and that. There are auto injectors that make it a lot easier, but recommending patients to switch sites if they are having some pain. Cold compresses, not too cold, of course, but cool compresses are going to help. Taking an antihistamine also sometimes reduces the swelling that might occur at the injection site. And there are also some off-label uses where people have used fluticasone and puffers that are sometimes used or are used for respiratory conditions sprayed onto the injection site to help reduce injection flares and reactions. The vaccine recommendations, generally the common ones like having a shingles vaccine administered for those who are 50 and over, flu vaccine, COVID-19 vaccine, the new RSV vaccine, and the pneumococcal vaccines that are out there, all are going to help reduce that risk of infection. When we look at that discontinuing effect with respect to denosumab, we can see in this presentation that was presented back in I think this was first in 2020. But with that discontinuation, they saw that there was a large change in vertebral fractures after discontinuing. So with that, there is now a very strong recommendation to, of course, be as adherent as possible to denosumab, administering it every 6 months. And if denosumab is to be discontinued, that another bone protection treatment is started. Usually it's a bisphosphonate, but of course that's going to be dependent on the patient's history and what's needed. And of course, that bone turnover sometimes are measured depending on how the drug or how the condition is being followed. In the studies that were done, it did report that compared to pre-treatment, after the last injection and 18 months without treatment, BMD returns actually back to baseline. And so we can see this reversal, and it's not too surprising then that fractures can occur. And that's what's shown in the right panel, that there are more multiple vertebral fractures that occur when there's a discontinuation. So that's with discontinuation and without. We also see that there are the primary endpoints with regards to a biosimilar denosumab. So now we're moving on to a comparison between a SDZ Dena, which is the denosumab biosimilar, and then the EU Prolia is the Prolia reference product. And we can see that there's no statistical difference with regards to the lumbar spine bone mineral density. And when plotted out, we can see that it essentially produces the same effect. And so based on these kinds of studies is how Health Canada will approve a biosimilar. So biologics do account for a high cost or high share of the cost of drugs expenditure, and disproportionately high because, of course, they are a higher cost than other molecules out there. So just to illustrate it to you so you can get some sort of a feel and why it's important to have biosimilars used to reduce costs, is that biologic expenditure does represent 27% of the total drug costs for Canadian public and private plans. And this is in the market trends published in 2018. However, when we look at the number of prescriptions or claims, it runs in the neighborhood of 1.5 to 1.9%. So I think in more current data, we're probably running at about 2%. But essentially, it's really disproportionate. And it just shows you that these are higher cost medicines. But we shouldn't attribute that to not using them, because they also have a higher impact on the patients that they treat. So by improving quality of life, improving productivity, improving convenience, adherence, and effect, and decreasing side effects, those are all things that need to be factored in when we're thinking about cost. So in general, biologics can range from $100 per month to $5,000 per month. And this is why, of course, coverage becomes very important. But because of these savings is why governments, and BC started all of this back in May of 2019. So that's a picture of our health minister, who happens to still be our health minister in BC. And they introduced the biosimilar initiative. And so it's not too unexpected that when there's an introduction of a biosimilar version at a lower cost compared to the originator, there's going to be policies that are put in place that encourage the use of the biosimilars. And so some specific rules were set in place that what's happening across the country is similar initiatives come across the country. So public plans have been offering a 6-month transition period, which is what BC introduced when it started. This means that the public plan will cover both the reference product as well as the biosimilar for 6 months, giving time for practitioners and for patients to transition from one to the other. New starts, however, are going to be only covered for the biosimilar. So this is somebody who's not switching, but starting new. They're only going to be covered if they're applying for that prior authorization for biosimilar. The reference product or originator is not covered at all. Most public plans that I'm aware of, haven't encountered any other public plans that will pay up to the price of a biosimilar. And, this is quite different from what we see with small molecules. So with small molecules, we will see coverage of the cost of that drug up to the cost of the generic. And if the patient wanted to pay the difference to go onto the brand name, they could do so. But with biologics, that's not the case. And again, because they are quite expensive, that's something that the public plan hasn't offered. And after 6 months, when that transition period is over, biosimilar is the only one that's covered. And if the patient wants to maintain that coverage, they're going to have to switch to the biosimilar that's approved. Some provinces have been offering a fee to physicians and pharmacists to educate patients about the imminent switch. And hopefully this is a good reminder and incentive to ensure that there is a health practitioner conversation that happens with patients to help support them with all of this new information. So for many patients, this may be the first time that they're being told to switch for what's sometimes referred to as a non-medical switch. That is, it's not being switched for medical reasons, but it's being switched for financial reasons to help decrease costs. There are some populations that are sometimes exempt that the provinces will announce. So as an example, many provinces will not force a switch on patients who are pregnant at the time. However, at some period after delivery, the switch will have to occur because coverage of the reference product stops. Children under 19 in many provinces aren't forced to switch over to the biosimilar. So until they turn 19, they can maintain on the reference product, again, in most provinces. And also sometimes patients with experiencing multiple treatment failures may be able to stay on the originator. However, an application needs to be made. And of course, the public plan needs to make that review and make that determination. So it's not a hard and fast rule, and it's all evaluated on a case-by-case basis. There are also some private plans out there. So private plans I'm referring to are like the Blue Cross, Manulife, Sun Life, etc. They may cover a reference biologic, even though it's at a higher price, just because it is a premium plan or plan administrator has decided to do that. What sometimes is quite scary, and the complaints that you might see and hear from patients, is when they do read what's in the media. Sometimes headlines, of course, sensationalize things. Surprise, surprise that the media is sensationalizing it. But it is what gets the readership. But I'm going back to 2019, when in Canada, we have, the first biosimilar initiative being announced in BC. And of course, these are the kinds of headlines that cause people to get a little bit concerned. So there are some, more factual headlines that say that, biosimilar drugs are bound to be applauded as they provide equivalent treatment at sometimes half the price. It's kind of a positive spin on it. Next generation of biologic therapy. And also where BC has started it and asked the other provinces to follow. And then you've also got reports like this, where the news is reporting the future is in doubt for cheaper versions of biologic drugs. And so this is certainly going to influence patients. And sometimes you have to be aware of how patients are coming in to speak with you about these biologics and biosimilars. And in 2019, there was a lot of them. A lot of stuff was coming out. And we had less information at the time. And particularly in the States, where it's more of a competitive market and everything else, we see this headline: combating misinformation on biosimilars and preparing the market for them can save the US billions. BC to become the first province to force patients to switch from biologics to less expensive biosimilar drugs. When you use words like force patients, it's certainly quite negative. And although in some places or some ways, patients will say that that's the truth, because without coverage, they're forced to, of course, take the one that is covered. But there are certainly different views on all of these. And this is just to bring up the fact that there are different perceptions, and something that as a healthcare provider, you might have to debunk or speak to, because you're going to have things like BC shifting to cheaper biosimilar drugs, health minister says. And, I would recommend that we never use the word cheaper, because that, again, just cheapens the perception of these products. BC embraces shift to cheaper biosimilars, and a first for Canada. We have patients, physicians raise concerns in BC with biosimilar non-medical switching policies. And in Ireland, Irish hospitals to get incentives to switch patients to biosimilars. So they're providing in some countries incentives to move patients over, because overall it's going to be a savings to the system. BC drug plan to save millions with the switch to cheaper copies. That was referring to biosimilars. And even some of the manufacturers get quite aggressive on it. So this is actually in an airport back in 2019. Not only did they take out a full-page ad, but they took out a full a billboard at one of the big airports. And so this is sometimes can be quite concerning when it's spoken wrong. And the reason I bring all of this up is this has dramatic effects on people and patients. So when we use words that seem to worsen the effect, we call this the nocebo effect, which I'm going to get into a bit more. But, avoid using terms like this treatment is just like. It's highly similar to is something I've heard, and probably a better way to describe a biosimilar. You should have a similar response to is reasonable. This treatment is covered for you. You'll have to pay for it yourself if you choose the innovator. That's more or less factual. Sometimes saying that it works just like could be taken both ways and might be good or bad. I think there's a negative perception when people are saying that the government makes me prescribe it. It's factual that the drug is less expensive than the originator. This should work just as well as, and this is a generic of, which is incorrect. So biosimilars are not a generic version of the reference product. So this all brings me to talk a little bit more about this nocebo effect. So this is where patients get a negative expectation, which is not really there. And this is because of what they hear, what they perceive. And, there have been studies done that show there is a true nocebo effect. And so there is increased discontinuation due to subjective measures of disease activities and adverse effects. Usually these are subjective things. And it just emphasizes the important or how important it is to speak and communicate with patients correctly. They did studies on generic substitution, and in general, in surveys, over a third of patients considered inexpensive products to be inferior. There were 13.2% of patients who already had experience with a generic substitute reported side effects that weren't seen with the brand. And it's unlikely that that number is that high when it's the essentially identical molecule. So they can be associated just because of perception. Another interesting study is this one that illustrates pain and nocebo effect. This was a randomized study in women who were at term gestation requiring labor epidural pain control. So these women were informed in two different ways. So these were the two study groups. One called the placebo group, and the doctor administering the epidural would say, we're going to give you a local anesthetic that will numb the area and you'll be comfortable during the procedure, which is accurate and true. And another way, in the other study population, you're going to feel a big bee sting. This is the worst part of the procedure. So guess what happened? Well, pain was assessed using a visual analog scale, and the median score was much lower with regards to the nicer words versus a score of 5, and it was statistically different. So just framing something positively. And when we do studies for pain medications, a 2-point difference is significant and pretty hard to achieve. Imagine how you say it can have the impact of medication that you might take systemically that is statistically different. So it just shows you how powerful what you say is. And this is another study just showing that there are truly effects when you speak to patients and how you say it. So some suggestions, we'll save time and money if we respond to patients' concerns and issues in a shared informed decision-making process. So I always advocate for informing patients fully and to have them participate in the decision. The more they're part of it, the more adherent, they'll be and have a better response, as we've seen in some trials. Leveraging other members of the healthcare team so that we're all speaking the same language, that we all I guess, are aligned in how we present the information is very important. And for those prescribers who can give pharmacists and others who see the orders, putting it on the prescription, the need for education or other options to use might also help. Um, People don't like to be forced, of course, to take anything or coerced. So let them know the choices and maybe let them choose. So rather than forcing them to take the one that's covered, it's not really an option for some, but at least they know that it's not the only choice. But if they could afford it or could pay for it, they could get the reference biologic. So we can avoid the nocebo effect. We can respect the patient's autonomy, which is something that we should do on an ongoing basis. We should have some consistent education for healthcare professionals, so we kind of talk the same language. And those that are not in remission, it might be just timing that causes them problems when they're switching to a biosimilar, and that would not be the best time to do it when they're not in remission during a flare. So, education by pharmacists, nurses, physicians about coverage options and what's covered. Sometimes the pharmacist has the best view of that, and so they can be referred to the pharmacist. Also, there's different injector pens that might go into the decision-making of which biosimilar version, if that is a consideration for patients, and also just approaching it in a fair and unbiased manner. Where I practice, we have private consultation pods where we'll talk with people and explain to them and use visuals. So with a computer screen pulling things up so we can discuss it. When the biosimilar initiative was launched, we actually set up a little education station and had pamphlets available. Many of these were produced by the government, so to be as as unbiased as possible. But of course, the government is encouraging the move to biosimilars. But the information that was there was factual and not really coercive or opinionated in any real way. We also keep the biosimilar version demonstrators so that people can see and feel and try to identify maybe which version that they're more comfortable with to make a choice. And just for some of those who are prescribers, there are some rules across the country with respect to biosimilars and biologics. And that is if it is written as a brand name, the pharmacist actually has to dispense what's written. There's no interchange unless the prescription needs to be adapted to suit the patient's needs. In Alberta, of course, there are authorized prescribers with additional prescribing authority, and these pharmacists can prescribe. But if on a prescription denosumab is written, in most provinces, the pharmacist can choose to fill with any version, innovator or biosimilar. However, in Ontario, it's not allowed to write just denosumab. The prescriber needs to actually write down a brand name. There's no post-dating of prescriptions. So although for denosumab in BC, the originator is going to be covered until March of 2025, you can't write a prescription that dated March, but you can put in a fill date of today, and that prescription actually it's been extended. I wrote 1 year here, but it should be actually 2 years in BC. But of course, it depends on which province that you're in. And if you prescribe, in a way where you want to give choice, you can specifically state Forteo, Osnovo, or tevaparatide with the dose, and then allow the pharmacist to identify which one is best for the patient. Teriparatide is interesting. It has a generic and a biosimilar, and because that molecule is just on the cusp of being too complex and still relatively a small molecule, it is possible to make an identical copy, and that's what Teva did, whereas Osnuvo is a biosimilar and approved as such, where clinical trials were required and submitted, and it's not interchangeable. So keep in mind that the generic version, tevaparatide, is a generic alternative to Forteo, but not a generic alternative to Osnuvo, which is a biosimilar. So it's only bioequivalent to its reference product. So just some takeaway points. Biosimilars have the same clinical efficacy and safety demonstrated in clinical trials. Biosimilars are becoming more common. We work hard to avoid that nocebo effect, and by aligning our education and using neutral words, that's going to help. And patients, of course, do rely on what health care professionals say. So it's very important that you consider how you say it and what you say to patients. And as we saw in that pain study, it's really important. Coverage and policies are changing, and so keeping up to date will avoid these frustrations with coverage, and knowing dates when a originator or reference biologics coverage stops is going to be important, because all of a sudden something's going to change. Best to use that transition period. So I'm just going to pause here for questions and see if there are questions out there. So maybe back to you, Kerry.
Thanks, Ellen. That was absolutely terrific. Lots of information to think about. We are going to turn to the question and answer period now. So let's get started with this question. Some biologic drugs have many biosimilar versions. How do prescribers and patients select the most suitable one?
Yeah, that's certainly challenging. I spoke about a few differences that prescribers and patients may consider, but there's some things that you may not be aware of that I'll just kind of outline here. But I did say that these biosimilars have patient support programs, and they're trying to differentiate themselves in some ways by providing added or different services. So you'll find that some patient support programs are covering vaccination costs. So where there are provinces where, let's say, a shingles vaccine is not being covered by the public plan, this patient support program for some of these options will actually pay for and reimburse the patient for getting the vaccine. And so that might steer a patient from one to the other. It could be the injection pen. Some are larger and some are thinner. Some are easier to press and some are more difficult to press. That may factor into the decision. But when we're talking about efficacy and safety, according to Health Canada and all the clinical trials, we see that we can't really make a choice based on efficacy and safety. They are all going to have the same clinical effect when we're looking at efficacy and safety. It's going to be the more peripheral other things that come into play. And that could be coverage of a vaccine. It could be that injector. It could also be the financial assistance. We're seeing in practice that there are some patient support programs that will offer financial assistance, whereas some don't or offer a very small amount. And that might be a reason for choosing one over the other. So oftentimes for prescribers, it might be just familiarity, because when we're talking about adalimumab and there's so many, you kind of want to know well the product that you're prescribing. It could be that it's a storage condition. So as I showed you in that table with adalimumab, one of them has a longer room temperature storage time. But if it doesn't matter, then that's not worthy of consideration. So really, we want to be patient focused and find out what's important to the patient, but it also means we need to know the differences between the biosimilar versions. So hopefully that answered the question, Kerry.
That was great, Ellen. Thank you. Next question. Since biosimilars are lower in cost, do they still require prior authorization or special authority applications in order to get coverage?
Yeah, so far what we've been seeing is that with the introduction of biosimilars, we have seen some public plans where they will list or make it easier for other drugs in that category to be used, or sometimes for the biologic itself, they will reduce or simplify the criteria so that more people get access. Haven't seen it change yet to see where prior authorization is completely removed. So paperwork is still going to be required. Hopefully what we're going to be seeing more of is that the paperwork is reduced. So instead of filling out a 2-page form, it becomes 1 page. Maybe as an example, in Ontario, where there's LU codes, it goes from filling out paperwork to just putting down the digits for a limited use code, and then it gets covered. So we do hope that it's going to simplify things, but it certainly moves it in that direction when there are biosimilars and lower cost. And maybe with the competition, as we see with adalimumab, with so many out there, it probably won't be long before manufacturers start to decide that they're going to try to get more sales by lowering their price so theirs gets chosen more frequently. And and there'll be differential in cost. But right now we're seeing that biosimilars, when they come out, they're pretty well all the same price or cost for the many versions with only slight variations. But unfortunately, prior authorization is still going to be required.
Okay. The next question I do believe you covered in your presentation, but you might want to revisit and emphasize a few points. The question is, when public health insurance asks to switch to biosimilars, are there any exceptions?
So the exceptions are going to be different province by province. I will have to say, and this is just my experience, it may not be everyone's and what I've seen, BC has been relatively difficult and stringent with regards to criteria, and so have had very few exceptions. And when you write in for the exceptions or prescribers write in, not often do they get approved. So it's been difficult. And I mentioned a few exceptions out there, like for those that are pregnant. So for the time being, when it's a recent switch policy coming into place, they won't switch somebody while they're pregnant. And there's usually some defined time after delivery that they will stop covering the reference product. but there's no universal exemption except for maybe allergy. So if clearly there was, and I don't think that this is the case with any of them, but let's say, just because I can't think of a good example, if the originator did not have sulfites and the other biosimilar version had a sulfite in it, and this person has anaphylactic, life-threatening allergic response, that would be something that would get approved. So, things that are very reasonable and clear like that. But when it is a little bit more subjective, it's hard to get an exemption. And so patients are often not going to be covered for the reference product and only covered for the biosimilar. So it'd have to be a really good reason, and the physician would have to write in and apply for it, and it's reviewed case by case.
Okay, this might be one of those situations. In the case of a severe side effect with a biosimilar, are there possibilities to switch back to the biologic or the reference?
So again, I can only go with what I've seen. There aren't any hard and fast criteria that are written up in any provinces that describe to you exactly what needs to be done before somebody gets switched back, because they're all case-by-case reviews. But certainly side effects in a poor response from a biosimilar does constitute one of those reasons why you might write in and have the prescriber see if they can get an exemption. However, it's not automatic, and many provinces will have the patient try, actually, if there's more than one biosimilar available, to try multiple biosimilars before going back to the originator. So this has been a relatively hard and fast rule. It didn't seem like any of the public plans really wanted to open the floodgates to make it so that everyone just remains on the reference product, because then there'd be no savings. So again, from experience, we've seen patients trying one, usually two other biosimilars before going back to the originator, and trying it sometimes is more than just one dose. It's actually a few doses to see the response, to see if the side effect goes away or not, because some side effects, of course, dissipate or disappear over time. And those side effects could be real because it could be due to what's in the excipients or what else is there. So besides the drug, in that liquid, of course, there are preservatives, there are stabilizers, there are all sorts of things that are keeping that material or that product and drug stable. And that's not going to be identical to the originator and between biosimilars. But all the plans do require trying another biosimilar before going back if it's more of a subjective reason.
Okay. We have time for one last question. Once Health Canada approves the biologic biosimilar treatment, how will the provinces and territories roll out the treatment, and how will costs be affected?
Yeah, so what we've seen, and this is different from a brand new drug coming out. So let's say when denosumab or Prolia was first introduced in the Canadian market and it received its notice of compliance or approval from Health Canada, it took some time before public plans across Canada were picking it up and having coverage after prior authorization was approved. When a biosimilar comes out, because it's really, a highly similar product with the same clinical efficacy and safety and at a lower cost, we see that public plans and private plans are very quick to put it on the list. So they often get listed within a month, if that, sometimes almost right away. And each province will have a different way of rolling it out. So for instance, in BC, it took maybe about 3 weeks after it was truly available on the market, where it could be prescribed and given to a patient, that BC Pharmacare then did their biosimilar initiative announcement. And the transition period started on August 29. It goes on for 6 months until March of 2025. And during that 6-month period, both are covered, the reference product and the biosimilar. And then after March, the reference product gets no coverage anymore. However, we'll also see that the reference product sometimes will offer something to help out, and that's seen in BC, where there are supports through what are sometimes referred to as patient support program cards or copay cards. They help to reduce some of the costs for patients. And in this particular situation, the reference product is offer a copay card to reduce the cost of the reference product down to the same cost of biosimilar. So somebody who doesn't have any approval or doesn't have a plan that's covering, whether they purchase the biosimilar or whether they purchase the reference product, it's going to be the same cost if they use this card. So we see different dynamics happening within the marketplace. That card currently, as I'm aware, is only available in BC because BC has started the biosimilar initiative on denosumab already. But I guess we could expect that that will probably cascade across the country. I can't say that for sure. But we do know that in BC, patients have that advantage. So at least if you're not covered, you can at least keep the cost the same for either option. And if you are covered, there's a transition period, and most of the private plans will follow the public plan. So what pharmacare does is usually what a private plan will do.
Okay. Well, thank you, Alan, for such an informative presentation. That was absolutely terrific. I also want to let folks know that on September the 16th, Dr. Letitia Michaud will be hosting a French webinar on the same topic. So please share with your colleagues to come back and listen to that presentation. If you require more information on osteoporosis, please visit our website at osteoporosis.ca. Our website includes many tools, including a nutrient calculator, podcasts, quizzes, and a repository of past webinars. This webinar will be there shortly, so you can revisit it if you'd like to. Please sign up as well for our newsletters so that you're always up to date about future seminars. We do seminars for healthcare professionals, so please watch for those. And again, thanks to all of you for joining us today. I hope you all have a great day and hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much.